Hello and welcome to episode 5. Today Jesse and I are going to begin to wrap up this brief series. At this point we have touched on colonial and indigenous mascot theory. With this conceptual background, we can now begin to briefly explore the ways indigenous mascots contribute to broader indigenous issues such as boil water advisories, missing and murdered indigenous women, unequal access to healthcare, and so much more. Before we get into it, we feel there is some information we should briefly cover. First, be sure to check out the bibliography in the description of this video. Second, we should address some of the language in some of the sources we reference. Many of these sources are written from the American context. Here in Canada, we use the term Indigenous, and the term Indian is seen as offensive. In America, the most commonly used and often preferred name is American Indian. Thus, many of our sources will use this language. At this point in the series, we have learned that the colonial system, which is invisible in nature, works to reduce Indigenous peoples to empty stereotypes and tropes, and that one way this is done is through problematic representations in the form of Indigenous mascots. For the purpose of this episode, we will be drawing on work from Foltz and colleagues. Foltz and colleagues found through their research 5 reasons why Indigenous mascots are extremely problematic.
The first reason Foltz and colleagues present is that Indigenous mascots provide racist and dehumanizing stereotypes. As we discussed in episode 2, this dehumanizing effect allows Indigenous issues to be ignored and perpetuated. One hypothetical scenario that has been presented to illustrate this is the ways that boil water advisories have been handled. Now we know that there are boil water advisories for many Indigenous communities in Canada, and yet consistently promises to change this have been defaulted on. Now let's imagine that the water supply for, say, the city of Edmonton, or even a smaller town, was contaminated, and the government said they would not resolve the issue because of budgetary constraints. The country would be in an uproar, but yet because Indigenous peoples are consistently dehumanized, these issues are simply accepted. The same goes for unequal access to healthcare. Again, Indigenous communities are usually provided with bare bones or even negligent healthcare systems, and the general public pays little attention. And when Indigenous peoples are able to access a fully functioning hospital, they're often reduced to stereotypes the second they walk in the door. This means that the quality of care they receive is of a much lesser standard than the rest of the patients.
The second problem Foltz and colleagues found with Indigenous mascots is that they misuse cultural practices and symbols. Now this is highly problematic because it perpetuates misinformations on Indigenous ways of being. This means that the majority of citizens only receive misinformation about Indigenous peoples. This can lead to very problematic outcomes when these people generally have the most power in society. These people have a huge amount of voting power and social capital, and this misinformation can influence their decisions and actions. The third issue Foltz and colleagues found with Indigenous mascots is that they deny Indigenous peoples control over the public representations of themselves. As I covered in episode 3, misrepresentations can have a detrimental impact on self-esteem. This also ties directly into the misinformation that is provided to people with lots of power.
The fourth issue that Foltz and colleagues found is that Indigenous mascots perpetuate violence and hostility against Indigenous peoples. This is obviously a very serious area of concern, which is not to say that the rest of the information in this series is not a very serious area of concern. But in this instance, we're talking about the immediate threat of violence or even the loss of life in some cases. This really ties into the misrepresentations and dehumanizing effects. When Indigenous peoples are reduced to the racist and dehumanizing stereotypes, it creates an extremely problematic and highly dangerous justification for physical violence. The colonial system has proven time and time again that Indigenous lives and personhood are not valued as they should be. When the rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women is as high as it is, and the entire country, let alone the whole world, isn't screaming for justice, there's definitely a problem.
The last reason Foltz and colleagues addressed is that Indigenous mascots actively contribute to the oppression of Indigenous peoples. When Indigenous activists are being repeatedly ignored and even turned into public enemies, for advocating for their civil rights, that is active oppression. And this is on top of all of the other instances of oppression we just covered.
Overall, our research has shown that Indigenous mascots are a serious issue that contribute to and reproduce the colonial system. This then creates, contributes to, or allows Indigenous issues to remain invisible. This is how an issue such as Indigenous mascots that seems so trivial is actually as problematic as boil water advisories, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and unequal access to healthcare. Thank you for sticking around, and please join us for our last video in the series, which will be a brief wrap-up with both Lainey and I.